Hello, and welcome back to the second half of the podcast about analyzing a text and Little Snow White. This is Rebecca McCarthy for South Seattle Community College and Composition 102. We left off with Little Snow White's discovery of the Seven Dwarfs' house. Now, many of us are familiar with the Disney story, so we see something quite different here. When she comes upon the house, she sees that the dwarfs are not there. They're all working in the mine, so the fact that they work in a mine is consistent with the stories that we probably have heard in our childhood. But here's some inconsistencies. Snow White went inside and found everything to be small, but neat and orderly. There was a little table with 7 little plates, 7 little spoons, 7 little knives and forks, 7 little mugs, and against the wall there were 7 little beds, all freshly made. Now, the fact that we have 7 beds and 7 of everything, that's not new. Most of us are familiar with the 7 dwarfs. What is new here, what is different, is that these dwarfs are neat and orderly, that their beds are all nicely made. If we remember ahead to the more modern stories, and especially after what Disney did with the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, what we have are messy dwarfs, right? They can't take care of themselves. They're messy. Their house is a mess, and Snow White dives in at some point and has to clean everything up, right? So this is an interesting character change from the characters that we see in the more modern stories. So this is something I'm also going to annotate and I'm going to put to the side. Again, though, we are also struck by the number 7. This is a reoccurring theme throughout the text. So again, we need to look up the number 7. We have to see what kind of meaning comes behind it, because it's a very important number throughout this entire text. So let's go on. So Snow White comes in. She's still hungry and thirsty because she's been in the woods. And what is interesting is she doesn't eat everybody's food. She just takes a little bit off of each plate. So this is an interesting kind of a choice for the character. The text reads, Snow White was hungry and thirsty, so she ate a few vegetables and a little bread from each little plate, and from each little glass she drank a drop of wine. So she doesn't take all of any one dwarf's food, but she tries to evenly distribute her thievery, if you will. So that's kind of fascinating. And what does this say about our character? And what does this say about being somebody who is fair, right? So remember, some of the questions I brought up earlier is there a difference between being fair and being beautiful? Is there a difference between inner beauty versus outer beauty? And is there a difference between innocence and age? Okay, so this is something else we can actually add to that category. She falls asleep on the 7th bed. Again, we have the number 7 popping up again. And she lays down and she sleeps. When the 7 little dwarfs come home, they notice that things have been disturbed. They've noticed that people have sat in their chairs and ate from their plates and ate their vegetables. And what's interesting, by the way, we have vegetables and bread but no meat. So these dwarfs appear to be vegetarians, which is also fascinating. So this is kind of a character, important character point about who these people are. And the other thing is, this is the first time we see a male presence in the story is through the 7 dwarfs, because we never meet little Snow White's father. So what does this mean for gender, right, in the story itself? That the dwarves are the first male characters that we encounter. And what does their character, how they are and who they are, how they are presented as compared to the female characters in this story, how can we assess what the authors are trying to tell us about gender by making these comparisons? What is being said again and what is not being said? Remember to keep these points in mind. So they find little Snow White, and they let her sleep through the night, which is quite generous, actually, rather than picking them up. And when she wakes up the next morning, she tells him her story, that that her mother, the queen, tried to kill her, and that the huntsman let her go free, and they strike a deal that Snow White can stay as long as she keeps their house. She cooks for them, she sews, she makes the bed, she washes, she knits, she keeps everything clean and orderly, that she can stay there. And that she would want for nothing. Little Snow White agrees to this deal. Now it's interesting because we have here quite an image of women's work, right? But what is interesting about this women's work is that she is royalty. Okay, normally she would have had servants to do this. So she is now taking on the role of a womanly job. And remember, she's still only 7 years old. So what does this mean? Something that we need to start to think about ourselves. We have now a normality of gender roles going on. Before, the seven dwarfs, they took care of the housework and they went out to work. So they did both traditional gender roles. But now that little Snow White is here, they can now take on just the traditional male role, which is going outside to work, bringing home the bacon, so on and so forth. And then little Snow White settles in as the traditional female role of work. So what does this mean, this division of work with labor within the gender roles? Something to think about as well. So we also are left with a warning. The little dwarves tell Snow White, okay, don't let the queen in. And Snow White agrees. But does she actually does this? No. So we go back to the mirror again and the queen finds out that Snow White is still alive. And of course she is just horribly angry about the whole thing. She knows she's been deceived, and she decides that Snow White does indeed need to die. So she becomes a peddler woman, and she goes out to find Snow White and to pretend to sell wares. Now, we have 3 instances in which the queen tries to kill Snow White. The first time, the queen tries to sell her bodice lace, and the queen laces Snow White's bodice up so much that it suffocates her, and it's like she has died. Now, we have to look at the significance of bodice lace, and we also need to look at the significance of binding a woman for her beauty, right? Again, we have a difference between outer beauty and inner beauty, fairness versus physical beauty, and something we need to think about here. And then the next time the queen comes, she brings a poison comb, a beautiful comb to put and adorn one's hair with. And it's almost as if the comb has killed Snow White. And again, we have this image of vanity. The first 2 instances, and it's interesting to note that the 7 dwarfs are able to bring Snow White back to life by cutting the bodice, the physical image of beauty, and by taking the poison comb out of her hair. But the 3rd attempt at killing Snow White is an apple, a red apple. Half the apple is poisoned, the other half is not poisoned. And what is interesting here is that if we look at the red and we consider how the color red was used originally in this story to signify blood, here is something that could really kill Snow White. It's not vanity, it is blood poisoning, right? So Snow White does get tricked into eating the apple, and it looks like she's about ready to die. Well, I mean that she is dead, and the dwarves can't bring her back to life this time. Now, what's interesting here is that the dwarves notice that she doesn't decay. So instead of burying her, they put her in a glass coffin, and the glass coffin is, again, a pretty consistent metaphor that we see through almost all of these stories. And the dwarves mourn for 3 days, and after they mourn for 3 days, even though most of the dwarves go to work, they always leave one dwarf behind to sit in vigil of Snow White. They love her that much. Then a young prince comes, and this young prince is so enamored once he sees Snow White in her coffin that he just has got to possess her, absolutely possess her. So we need to think about what this means again about inner beauty versus outer beauty and the possession of beauty. The prince wants to buy the coffin, but no matter how much money he offers the 7 dwarfs, they always turn it down. And then the prince asks if the 7 dwarfs will give him the coffin because he is so in love, and the dwarfs agree. This is fascinating. The dwarves are willing to separate with the coffin only as a gift, not as a payment. So what does this mean? So this is another annotation I am making to the side of my notes. Now, finally, the last interesting things about this particular story is how Snow White comes back to life. In the later stories, we have the prince kissing Snow White, and that alone is enough to bring her back. But in this story, the prince can't be separated from the coffin, so the servants have to carry this coffin around no matter where Snow White goes. And eventually the servants get really pissed off about it. I suspect a glass coffin with a young girl, 7-year-old girl in it, is pretty darn heavy. So at one point, one of the servants opens the coffin up and slaps the Snow White, this dead woman, in the back of the head, and the apple pops off and she is brought back to life. She actually walks to the prince and then they get married. So this is an interesting difference. We have a moment of violence that brings her back, and it's the servant and not the prince himself. The last interesting aspect of this story is how the mother, the godless Snow White's mother, dies. And she dies by wearing a pair of iron shoes that have been put in the fire until they glowed, and then she is forced to dance at their wedding until she dies. So, what does this mean? Why do we have iron shoes? Why would the queen even be willing to put these iron shoes on? Did they force them on her? These are all questions that we are left with, and we need to annotate our text with them. And that completes the second part of our podcast series. The third part of the podcast is going to examine what you can do to find different themes and comparison between the stories and your final paper in this course.